Hello friends, welcome back to the AWS series. Today is day 3. In our last video, we learned how AWS organizations help us centrally manage multiple AWS accounts. Now, from a solution architect's perspective, another important challenge is how to centrally manage user access across all of those AWS accounts. Think about a typical enterprise environment. You will have multiple AWS accounts: development, SIT, UAT, production, security, shared services, and many more. Now, imagine hundreds or even thousands of employees needing access to these accounts. So the question is, can we simply create IAM users in every AWS account? Well, technically, yes, we can. But in a real enterprise environment, it's not a recommended approach because it does not scale and quickly becomes difficult to manage. Without a centralized identity solution, every user would have to maintain separate IAM usernames and passwords for different AWS accounts. And honestly, nobody likes remembering a different username and a password for every new system. This is exactly where AWS IAM Identity Center comes into the picture. Well, AWS IAM Identity Center allows us to centrally manage and simplify access to multiple AWS accounts and AWS applications such as AWS Kiro, Amazon QuickSight, AWS Builder ID applications, and third-party applications like Salesforce, Slack, Datadog, and many more. A quick pointer here: AWS Single Sign-On AWS SSO was renamed to AWS IAM Identity Center. So if someone says AWS SSO or IAM Identity Center, they are referring to the same application. Another good thing is that AWS IAM Identity Center is available at no additional cost. Also, it allows users to sign in to AWS using their existing corporate credentials. And these corporate identities can come from an external identity provider such as Microsoft Entra ID. It was formerly known as Azure Active Directory, Okta, Ping Identity, OneLogin, Keycloak, Active Directory, or many other SAML 2.0 or OIDC compatible identity providers. Now let's understand the overall authentication flow. The user first opens the AWS IAM Identity Center user portal. AWS IAM Identity Center then redirects the user to the organization's identity provider such as Microsoft Entra ID or Okta. The user signs in using their normal corporate username and password. After successful authentication, the identity provider sends the authentication response back to AWS IAM Identity Center. Well, AWS IAM Identity Center then checks which permission sets have been assigned to the user. Based on those permission sets, AWS Identity Center automatically allows the user to assume the appropriate IAM role in the authorized AWS account. The user simply selects the AWS account they want to access, and they are signed in without needing separate IAM credentials for that account. That's the overall authentication flow. So in simple terms, AWS Identity Center enables single sign-on to your AWS accounts using your corporate credentials. It integrates easily with corporate identity providers such as Microsoft Entra ID, Okta, Keycloak, Active Directory, and many others. One of the biggest advantages of this approach is user lifecycle management. When a new user joins the organization, the administrator simply assigns the required permissions in the corporate identity provider and AWS IAM Identity Center. The user can immediately access the AWS accounts they are authorized to use. Similarly, when an employee leaves the organization and their corporate identity is disabled or removed, their access to AWS is automatically revoked. There is no need to manually log into every AWS account and delete individual IAM users. This makes access management much simpler, more secure, and much easier to scale across large enterprise environments. Next, let's understand identity sources, because this is one of the most important concepts to understand when working with AWS IAM Identity Center and implementing single sign-on. So, what is an identity source? Well, an identity source in AWS Identity Center defines where your users and groups are managed. Once you configure an identity source, AWS IAM Identity Center can look up those users and groups and grant them single sign-on access to AWS accounts, AWS applications, third-party applications, or all of them. One important point to remember is that an AWS organization can have only one active identity source configured for AWS IAM Identity Center at a time. The first option is an external identity provider. Choose this option if your organization already manages users in an external identity provider such as Microsoft Entra ID, Okta, Ping Identity, OneLogin, Keycloak, or any other SAML 2.0 or OIDC compatible identity provider. In this model, users continue to be managed in the external identity provider, while AWS IAM Identity Center simply trusts that provider for authentication and authorization. The second option is Active Directory. Choose this option if your organization already uses Microsoft Active Directory either on-premises or AWS managed Microsoft AD. AWS IAM Identity Center integrates with your existing Active Directory, allowing your employees to use their existing Windows or corporate credentials to access AWS accounts and applications. This option is commonly used by enterprises that already have an established Active Directory environment. The third option is the Identity Center directory. When you enable AWS IAM Identity Center for the first time, AWS automatically configures an Identity Center directory as the default identity source, unless you choose a different identity source during setup. With the Identity Center directory, you create and manage your users and groups directly within AWS IAM Identity Center. You can then assign the appropriate permission sets to those users and groups, giving them access to the required AWS accounts and applications. This option is ideal for smaller organizations or learning environments where you don't already have an external identity provider or Active Directory. Now, let's see all this in practice. Let's go to AWS Management Console and configure AWS IAM Identity Center. Well, this is my AWS console, and here I am logged in as the root user of my AWS management account. This account already has AWS organizations configured, which we covered in our previous video. To access AWS IAM Identity Center, click Services in the top left corner of the AWS Management Console, then navigate to Security, Identity and Compliance and select IAM Identity Center. Once you are on the IAM Identity Center page, you will see the option to enable IAM Identity Center. So click the Enable button. AWS now provisions an IAM Identity Center instance for your AWS organization. Click on Enable again. This process usually takes just a few minutes. Once it is completed, AWS IAM Identity Center is enabled and you can start configuring your identity source, users, groups, permission sets, and AWS account assignments. Once IAM Identity Center has been enabled, you will see the message, you have successfully created the organization instance of IAM Identity Center. This means that AWS has successfully provisioned an IAM Identity Center instance for your AWS organization. Now let's quickly understand the important settings shown on the page. The first setting is the identity source here. As you can see, by default it is set to Identity Center directory. This is the default identity source that AWS configures when you enable IAM Identity Center for the first time, unless you choose a different identity source such as Microsoft Entra ID or Active Directory. Next, we have the issuer URL for OIDC applications and clients. This URL is used by OIDC compatible applications to trust and authenticate users through AWS IAM Identity Center. In other words, applications that use the OpenID Connect OIDC protocol use this URL to integrate with IAM Identity Center for user authentication. Here you can see AWS Access Portal URLs also. The first one is dual stack URL. This URL supports both IPv4 and IPv6 connectivity. That's why it is the recommended access portal for modern networks. Next is regional IPv4 URL. This URL provides access to the IAM Identity Center user portal over IPv4 and is specific to the AWS region where IAM Identity Center is configured. Finally, you will see IPv4 only. This is the traditional AWS Access Portal URL that works only over IPv4 networks. AWS continues to provide this URL for compatibility with existing environments and applications that do not yet use IPv6. Now, let's look at a few more important settings. From the left navigation pane, we can click on Settings. Alternatively, from the Settings Summary page from here, you can simply click Go to Settings. Here you will find the details of the current identity source, that is Identity Center directory by default, and from this page you also have the option to change it later if your organization's requirements change. If we click on Actions, here you will notice two options. One is Change Identity Source and another one is Customize AWS Access Portal URL. For now, let's customize the AWS Access Portal URL. So click on Customize Access Portal URL. So here, AWS allows you to specify a custom subdomain for your organization's access portal. For example, I will use Cognexa as my subdomain. So enter Cognexa in the subdomain field. AWS asks you to confirm it. So simply copy the same value and paste it into the confirmed field. Now the access portal URL becomes https://cognexa.awsapps.com/start. Click on Save. Here, if you receive an error saying that the alias is already associated with another directory, it simply means that someone else has already reserved that subdomain globally. In that case, choose another unique subdomain, for example Cognexa-tech or something else, and try saving again. Once the update is successful, you will see the confirmation message. The AWS Access Portal URL was successfully updated. Perfect. From now on, this URL becomes your organization's IAM Identity Center access portal. Users can simply open this URL in their browser, sign in using their credentials, and access the AWS accounts and applications that have been assigned to them through AWS IAM Identity Center. We will use this URL later in this demo to sign in and verify that single sign-on is working correctly. Now let's look at another important setting under the authentication section. Here we can configure multi-factor authentication (MFA) for users signing in through AWS IAM Identity Center. By default, AWS IAM Identity Center requires user to register an MFA device when they sign in for the first time. To view or change this behavior, click on Configure in the multi-factor authentication section. Since this is a lab environment, I am going to simplify the sign-in process. I will select Allow them to sign in. This is without MFA option. With this setting, users can sign in using just their username and a password. However, this is not the recommended setting for production environments. For real enterprise workloads, you should always enable MFA to add an extra layer of security. In my organization, we currently use the option require them to provide a one-time password sent by email to sign in. With this configuration, every time we sign in, AWS IAM Identity Center sends a one-time password, that is OTP, to our registered email address, which we must enter to complete the authentication process. Another commonly used option is require them to register an MFA device at sign-in. With this option, users register an authenticator application such as Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator and then use the time-based one-time password generated by that application whenever they sign in. This approach is generally considered more secure than email-based OTP and is widely adopted in enterprise environments. For this demo, I will select Allow them to sign in. Finally, click Save to apply the changes. On successful completion, you will see a message like multi-factor authentication settings have been updated. Now, from the left navigation pane, click Users. Under the User section, we can create and manage users who will use the AWS IAM Identity Center access portal to sign in and access AWS accounts and applications. Let's create our first user. For that, click on Add User button. The first field is username. So I will enter our username. Next, you will see two options for setting up the user's password. The first option is send an email to this user with password setup instructions. If you choose this option, AWS IAM Identity Center sends an email to the user's registered email address with instructions to create their own password. The second option is generate a one-time password that you can share with this user. If you select this option, AWS generates a temporary one-time password that you can securely share with the user. The user can then use this password during their first sign-in and will be prompted to create a new password. These two options simply define how the user receives their initial sign-in credentials. For this demo, I will select the second option, that is generate a one-time password. Next, provide the email address. Confirm the email address. Now enter the user's details, first name and the last name also. The display name is automatically populated as first name and last name. The remaining fields such as contact methods, job related information, address and other optional details can be left empty for this demonstration. Click next. On the next page, AWS gives you an option to add this user to one or more groups. Since we haven't created any groups yet, we will skip this step for now. Click next again. Here, review all the details one final time and then click add user. The user has now been created successfully. AWS IAM Identity Center now displays the user sign-in information along with the one-time password that was generated. Make sure to copy or securely save this one-time password before leaving the page, as we will need it later when we sign into the AWS IAM Identity Center Access portal using this user account. Or copy the entire sign-in instructions and save it securely. I have saved the sign-in instructions including the one-time password. Now let's close this window. The next step is to create a group. If you are working in a real organization, you should first check whether the required group already exists. In most enterprise environments, administrators typically create groups. Since this is a fresh lab environment, we don't have any groups yet. So let's create one. For creating a group, from the left navigation pane, click Groups and then click Create Group. Now we need to provide the group details. The first field is the group name. I will name the group CloudOps_POC_full access. In real organizations, it's a good practice to follow a consistent naming convention for groups. For example, you can use a format like team_role. Here full access is the role, or environment_role. This makes it easy to identify the purpose of the group just by looking at its name. Next is the description field. Although this field is optional, it's a good practice to provide a meaningful description. For this demo, I will enter like AWS account and then account ID. You could also include additional information such as account name, environment, or the purpose of the group if required. Next, under the Add Users to Group section, you will see the users that we have already created. Select the user that we created a few minutes ago. Finally, click Create Group button. That's it. The group CloudOps_POC full access has been successfully created and our user has been added to the group. Before signing in as a user, there is one more important step. We first need to grant the required permissions and access. To do that, we will create a permission set. Well, a permission set is essentially a reusable collection of IAM permissions that AWS IAM Identity Center uses to grant access to AWS accounts. You can think of it as a reusable IAM policy template such as administrator access, read-only access, or any custom set of permissions. When a permission set is assigned to a user or group for a specific AWS account, AWS IAM Identity Center automatically provisions an IAM role in that AWS account with the permissions defined in the permission set. One important point to remember is that permission sets are created once at the IAM Identity Center level and can be reused across multiple AWS accounts. They are not created separately for each AWS account. In a real organization, you will often find that the required permission sets have already been created by the platform or cloud administration team. Since this is a fresh lab environment, we don't have any permission sets yet. So let's create one. From the left navigation pane, under multi-account permissions, click Permission Sets. Here no permission sets yet. So click on Create Permission Set. AWS provides two options: predefined permission sets and custom permission set. Under predefined permission sets, AWS provides several commonly used options such as administrator access, billing, network administrator, read-only access, power user access, and many more. You also have the option to create your own custom permission set by using custom permission set. For this demonstration, let's select custom permission set and click next. On the next page, we need to specify the permissions. So expand AWS managed policies and select administrator access. Here one point to note, in many organizations, instead of using the AWS managed administrator access policy, you will typically attach your organization's own custom full access policy that follows your security standard. And click next. Now we need to provide the permission set details. For permission set name, I will enter full access. You can also configure the session duration, which determines how long a user can remain signed in before they need to authenticate again. We will keep the default value for this demo. Click on next. Here, review the configuration and click on create. That's it. The full access permission set has now been created successfully. You can also see the confirmation message. The permission set full access was successfully created. Now comes the most important step. We need to assign this permission set to an AWS account through our group. This is the step that actually grants access. In other words, we are binding three things together: the AWS account, the group or user, and the permission set. Until these three are associated, the user still cannot access the AWS account. Let's see how to do that. From the left navigation pane, under the multi-account permission, click on AWS accounts. Here you will see all the AWS accounts that belong to your AWS organization. In our previous demo, we have created the workloads organizational unit, then created the banking OU under it, and finally created the member account Cognexa Banking Dev. Now let's grant our user access to this member account. Here notice that under the permission set column, it is currently blank, which means no users or groups have been assigned access yet. So select the Cognexa Banking Dev account and click on Assign Users or Groups. Next, select the Groups tab. Choose the group CloudOps POC Full Access that we created earlier. You can expand selected users or groups to verify that the CloudOps POC Full Access group is available here. Click Next. On the next page, select the full access permission set that we created earlier. Click Next again. Here, review the configuration one final time and then click Submit. That's it. The assignment is now complete. And we can see the message successfully configured all assignments. That means that every user who is the member of CloudOps POC Full Access group now has the permissions defined in the full access permission set for the Cognexa Banking Dev AWS account. Now let me explain what happens behind the scene, because this is a very important concept from an AWS Solution Architect perspective. When we assign a permission set to a group or user for an AWS account, AWS IAM Identity Center automatically creates and manages an IAM role inside that target AWS account. The role is automatically named something similar to AWS Reserved SSO, Full Access, and some random hash. This IAM role has a trust policy that allows AWS IAM Identity Center to assume the role after the user successfully authenticates through the Identity Center. AWS also attaches the IAM policies defined in the permission set to this automatically created IAM role. The important point to remember is that you never create or manage this IAM role yourself. AWS IAM Identity Center manages its entire lifecycle for you, including creating the role, updating its permissions whenever the permission set changes, and removing the role automatically if the assignment is deleted. This is one of the biggest advantages of AWS IAM Identity Center because administrators only need to manage users, groups and permission sets, while AWS takes care of provisioning and managing the required IAM roles in each member account automatically. Now let's test everything we have configured by signing in through the AWS IAM Identity Center user access portal. So here click on dashboard. Under AWS access portal URLs, you will find the user access portal URL. In my case, I am using IPv4 only. Copy this URL and open new private window and paste the URL. This simulates how an end user would access AWS using IAM Identity Center. Now enter the username. For me it's Sumit. Click on next. Enter the one-time password that we saved earlier and click on sign in. Since this is the user's first sign in, AWS IAM Identity Center requires the user to create a new password. So enter a new password. Confirm it by entering it again and then click set new password. Perfect. We are now successfully signed into the AWS IAM Identity Center user portal. Here you can see the AWS account that has been assigned to this user through the CloudOps POC full access group and the full access permission set. Here click on this full access. As you can see, I am now successfully logged into the Cognexa Banking Dev AWS account with the permissions defined in the full access permission set. And that's how simple it is for end users. As we have just seen, AWS IAM Identity Center not only centralizes and simplifies identity and access management for administrators, but it also provides a seamless single sign-on experience for end users. So instead of remembering separate IAM usernames and passwords for multiple AWS accounts, users simply sign in once using their corporate credentials and securely access all the AWS accounts and applications they have been authorized to use. This makes AWS environments more secure, easier to manage, and much more scalable for enterprise organizations. Well, that's all for today's session. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next video. Meantime, happy learning.